Inconsistency in mutual fund performance. Another issue plaguing most large cap equity fund managers is the inconsistency in the performance of the fund. Ambit Capital's analysts have used data from mutualfundindia.com to quantify this issue. Exhibit 27. The leading mutual funds lack the consistency to keep outperforming peers. One of the 22 funds that were in the top 25% or quartile in terms of their performance between financial year 2007 to 9, only 36%, approximately one third, remained in the top quartile over the subsequent 3-year period, FY 2010 to 13. Almost half of them, 45%, ended up in the bottom two quartiles of the performance or in the bottom 50%. The same story played out in the next phase. Approximately one third of the top performing funds in FY 2010 to 13 retained their place in the top quartile over FY 2014 to 16. Around 42% again ended up in the bottom two quartiles. This indicates that of the 22 funds, only two to three maintained consistency in their performance over FY 2007 to 16. We can thus conclude that not only has the outperformance of large cap equity mutual funds as an asset class more or less vanished, but there is randomness even in the relative performance of the mutual funds. The inconsistency in the mutual fund's relative performance also shows us why the past performance of a fund does not indicate future outperformance. All this is compelling evidence that the Indian market is becoming more efficient. In such a scenario, it is difficult to see how these funds will be able to keep attracting investors if they keep charging such high fees. Costs dictate the flows. The Americans were the first to fall in love with passive funds. In America, investors seem to be totally convinced about the alpha squeeze and the need for low expense ratios. In the calendar year 2016, active funds in the US saw a net outflow of 326 billion US dollars compared to passive funds which reported a net inflow of 429 billion US dollars. This shift has not been one off. In fact, in the last 10 calendar years, from 2007 to 16, only twice, that is 2009 and 2010, has the active funds inflow been more than passive funds. According to Morningstar, 4 out of these last 10 years have seen net outflow from active funds. Even with active funds, the outflow is not uniform. American investors have taken out the maximum monies from high cost funds. According to Morningstar, if we were to divide the active funds into two categories, the cheapest 20% and the remaining 80%, then from year 2007 to 16, the cheapest 20% have seen net outflows only once, while the remaining 80% have seen net outflow on 6 out of 10 occasions. Thanks to these tectonic shifts in the investor preferences, passive funds have gained significant AUM over active funds. From less than 10% of the turn at the turn of the century, passive funds today command 37% of the total fund industry AUM in the US. Morningstar estimates that passive funds AUM will be close to 50% or half of industry assets by calendar year 2021. Developments in India. In the 1990s and 2000s, the trend of upfront commission and upfronting of trail commission to intermediaries accelerated. This not only reduced investors' returns net of fees but also encouraged unethical selling practices. Over the years, SEBI has intervened repeatedly and successfully brought down these expenses. It has now capped the expense ratio of equity mutual funds and debt mutual funds to 2.5% per annum and 2.25% per annum, respectively. In 2009, SEBI abolished entry loads, which meant that the fund houses could not charge the client any upfront fees. This also has reduced to a large extent that distributors' incentive to churn. Mutual funds continued to incentivize distributors by giving them exorbitant upfront commissions from their own pockets. In calendar year 2013, for example, mutual funds offered between 5 and 8% upfront commissions to distributors to sell closed-ended equity funds. It resulted in total equity mutual fund sales of 7,000 crore rupees, most of which were into such closed-ended scheme. In response, SEBI through AMFI, the mutual fund industry's trade body, introduced the best practice guidelines in 2015. The guidelines stated that upfront commission that a fund pays to a distributor cannot be more than 1%. The guidelines also placed restrictions on trail commissions and mandated that for subsequent years it should not be higher than that of the first year. SEBI also made it mandatory to disclose the commissions paid to distributors in the account statement of the investors. Thanks to mutual fund selling practices coming under such scrutiny by 2015, distributors had shifted to hard selling more lightly regulated products, PMS schemes, and AIFs. Direct schemes, SEBI's knockout punch. Direct schemes were launched by SEBI in 2007. A direct scheme of a mutual fund has the least expense possible because mutual fund cannot give commission to any brokers. Direct code investment give investors an option to deal directly with the fund house without an intervention by intermediaries like distributors, agents, financial planners, banks, etc. The process to buy the scheme remains the same except that the investor keeps a broker code field empty in the mutual fund application form. There was minimal awareness of these direct schemes in the investing community because it was against the interest of the fund house distributor Nexus to market these schemes. In fact, most of the fund houses never launched the direct options for their popular schemes. Then in 2013, SEBI mandated that all mutual funds had to have a direct option for all the schemes. This meant that an investor now did not have to limit his or her investment universe if they wanted to go direct. Direct plans are much cheaper by 0.5 to 1% per annum in equity and 0.05 to 0.5% per annum in debt. These fees were almost half the expenses charged by conventional mutual funds, which remains in the vicinity of 2 to 2.5% in equity and 0.5 to 2.25% in debt. The difference in fees is obviously due to the distributor or broker being disintermediated by direct schemes. The results have been game changing. See Exhibit 28. And SEBI deserves a lot of credit for that. Already 38% of the industry's 20 lakh crore rupees of assets under management is in direct code. June 2017. The effect of direct schemes has been most pronounced in debt funds and 61% of assets under management now under direct code. In equity funds, 13% of assets under management are now under direct code. These numbers will keep rising as the trend towards direct is now irreversible. Given the limited value addition from distributors and mutual funds, investors are increasingly choosing the direct schemes. Exhibit 28. Direct schemes are pulling away assets under management from distributors. Let us revisit the effect of compounding of expenses and show below the difference in return in direct versus regular schemes, assuming 1.5% per annum and expense in the former and 2.5% in the latter. We have again assumed 15% annual returns from the underlying investment products. Exhibit 29. Direct fund returns far exceed funds with higher expense initial corpus of rupees 1 lakh. A 20-year-old who invests 1 lakh rupees at the start of his career will get 1.6 crore at the age of 60 from his investment in the direct fund, which has no involvement with any distributor. In contrast, he will get only 1.1 crore in the regular scheme. As much as 50 lakh rupees, or staggering 31% of his returns, are taken away by distributors from whom he bought the fund 40 years ago. So, if you are an investor prone to using brokers and distributors to buy fund management products, you might want to investigate how many crores you end up paying to them. Next stop, advisors only. Thankfully for the Indian investor, SEBI continues to intervene forcefully in his or her favor. The regulations announced in 2013 state that an intermediary can only be an advisor or distributor. He cannot be both. Thus, a distributor cannot be seen as recommending a mutual fund scheme. He can only execute the transaction on the client's behalf when asked to. Similarly, an advisor can only advise on which funds to invest. He cannot be a broker for that transaction. The solution from this solution from SEBI could eliminate the conflict of interest inherent in mutual fund distribution, where the broker or distributor of mutual funds has historically been the investor's main advisor. Given that in the new regulatory construct, an advisor cannot earn anything from the schemes he's recommending, his advice will be for the client's benefit rather than chasing the most remunerative scheme for himself. He earns an advisory fee which typically varies between 0.1% and 1% of the assets advised directly from the client, which is part of the contract between him and the client. This contract and fee construct now aligns the investor's interest with that of the advisor. Why? Because the client now invests in direct schemes and the distributor does not get any commission from the product he is recommending. He then naturally advises the investor to buy the fund most suitable for them. Conclusion: the future is looking brighter for Mr. Talwar. The old model of manufacturing and distributing mutual funds is broken at every level in India. Firstly, it is no longer obvious that actively managed large cap equity mutual funds in India consistently generate outperformance thanks to the greater level of transparency and competition in the Indian stock market. This has created a large opportunity for passively managed equity mutual funds in India that charge fees which are significantly lower than actively managed equity mutual funds, 0.1% versus 2%. Secondly, thanks to regulatory intervention and technological advances, investors no longer have to rely on the broker or the distributor to provide access to mutual funds. Investors can now directly buy mutual funds from the fund manufacturers at the click of a button. Furthermore, since the new construct removes the distributor from the picture, it results in expenses almost halving for the investor, which in turn means significantly higher returns. Finally, SEBI has created a new regulatory construct which forces intermediaries to declare whether they are fund distributor and will therefore have their interests aligned with the fund manufacturers, or an advisor whose fees will be paid by the ultimate investor and whose interests are fully aligned with the investor. The combination of hiring a good advisor and then purchasing sensibly priced funds directly from the fund houses gives investors a higher chance of generating healthy returns whilst keeping risk under control. Over the next decade, the vestiges of the old system will give way completely to the new order, and the investor will be the biggest beneficiary. The three key takeaways from this chapter: number one, fund expenses are often ignored but are deceptively important given their compounding over long periods. They have the ability to drag down investors' return drastically. For example, rupees 1 lakh invested for 40 years and assumed to grow at 15% per annum becomes rupees 1.1 crore and rupees 2.58 crore at annual expense of 2.5% and 0.1%. Unlike early years, alpha or outperformance in large cap equity mutual funds is now negligible. In this scenario, it makes much more sense to invest in passive funds or ETFs. Already in the US, active funds have started seeing massive outflows, which are becoming inflows for the passive funds. A broker suggesting funds to an investor leads to a conflict of interest. Driven by SEBI, the country has already moved to an only advisor or only broking model. Thus, an investor is better off paying a percentage as advisory and investing in the most inexpensive funds, as opposed to the traditional practice of using an intermediary who is remunerated by the fund manufacturers.